Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back after a little bit of a break. Happy New Year, everyone. We've got a bit of a market update, not everything that's happened since we last recorded a video, but some selected market and data updates. A bit of an overview of GDT 371 and, of course, chart of the week.
Start out with some summarised changes of what's occurred since we last spoke. So the EU butter market, it's been firming for, you can see the comparison there from 3 weeks ago. So that's mid-December. That's probably the last time we did a video, but certainly firmer through Q1 in that period, mostly in recent times. And we're seeing this reflected in book trades. You know, this comes at the same time as plenty of milk in the short term, spot prices falling, cream has dropped well below 8,000 euros a tonne. So it can be interesting to see what happens, but there's still pretty strong faith in fact that there isn't going to be an abundant amount of milk and cream available through that period because this is still historically quite high.
Just turning to skim milk powder now, on DAX futures, there's not been so much activity, drifting a little bit weaker. Demand still sluggish. We've been in this situation for quite some time. And skim milk concentrate still quite cheap. And then staying with S&P, SGX S&P futures really reflected those weaker pulse results. That was, some key pieces of information that we did get in the last few weeks, those two pulse auctions that drifted weaker, and the futures have pretty much followed that trend, Steve.
So US product output data came out. US production shows, this looks a bit odd when you see milk is down 1%, as we know that came out pre-Christmas. But we see cheese still, well down really, nearly 2% overall. Cheddar down, more than 3.5%. That's a fact that's feeding into the availability of cream. We see big declines in skim milk powder again, and that's a lot to do with milk production struggling with bird flu. But you say, does that look odd with butter being up so much? But when you think about the fact that there is a glut of cream about, mozzarella output being up, pretty sloppy cream market when you look at the cream multiples, and high components coming off farm, still that persists. So there is a lot of butter fat around, and some of that's going into making butter with available supplies.
Sure. So US exports also came out for November, and US exports actually fell in milk solids equivalent terms 3.7% for the month. And Steve, that was the first fall in monthly exports since January 2024. So it's been quite an impressive run in terms of export activity for the US over the course of 2024. Big changes for butter there, Steve.
It's probably easier to look at these changes and make sense of them if you take butter out. So we go to the next slide where, butter, look, it's an impressive increase, up nearly 100% the last month. But that, over the 6-month period, the increase in butterfat exports or butter exports is just 4,000 tonnes overall. Very small numbers. More interestingly, there's a few categories starting to slow. So cheese trade, that's a much slower growth. Cheese to Mexico is still holding up in terms of monthly tonnages, about the average for the last year in terms of monthly exports. WPC 80 also starting to slow, and that's mostly about China. Dry whey, also a China story, now tanking. There's 2 months in a row that we've seen double-digit declines. So that's how that now plays out as we're heading into a difficult period where tariffs start to come into play, particularly to China. Southeast Asia is the big drag on skim milk powder trade there, down nearly 20%. So pretty interesting data all around. What about the imports, Joe?
Yeah, on the import side, again, some interesting butter numbers. Highest ever monthly butter imports in November 2024. But Steve, what we're really seeing, we think, is a lot of front-loading activity before these possible tariffs come into place. And with the euro weaker, it's been pretty good buying for butter importers into the US in the last part of 2024. So that butter is probably still in warehouses somewhere, Steve.
Yeah, and I think, a comment I made in this morning's webinar, that the butter trade, I think the booking of butter trade, given how long it takes to get onto ships and into the pipeline, probably started after that first debate when tariff reality started to be in focus. And we certainly, as we've got closer to inauguration date, that threat gets stronger. Okay, GDT 371 into the new year. Down 1.4% overall. Powders fell 2 to 3%. There are some different changes amongst the suppliers. Butter was up nearly 3% overall, and that includes the effect of EU product, which is mixed with the average in recent results. And while we see cheddar up as well, but EU mozzarella also improved, which is standout. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah, looking at these demand supply ratios, Steve, you can see that demand was generally weaker, about the same for whole milk powder, but well down for skim milk powder and AMF. But butter much stronger, and we did have a bit more volume available of butter fats at this event as well.
We'll come on to that.
Hmm.
So whole milk powder was down across the curve. When we look at recent pulse, though, a little bit different.
Both milk powders actually lifted from the last pulse result we had, Steve. Whole milk powder was up $45 a tonne or 1.2% on the latest pulse, but still below the pulse event that was held around Christmas. And it's down 2.1% on GDT 370, the last one for 2024. And really, this tells the story, Steve. We saw a reduction in purchasing from China, and this was actually the lowest volume purchase since July last year, and below 30% of the sales volume for this event. And it's very rare that we see China fall below that 30% line. And at the same time, the Middle East, who are very good at coming in when prices are falling, came back, increased their purchases this time round, Steve. But as you can see, looking back in time, when prices were a fair bit lower, they're not back at those volumes as yet.
And you can see that this is relatively expensive for where they bought that monthly tonnage across there. So will they stay there? And depends on direction, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Another fall in skim milk powder, worse. The falls were worse later. But again, compared to pulse, it's interesting.
Yeah, we were down on the last GDT auction 370 by 2% in terms of the skim milk powder, but actually 3% up on last week's pulse event. We're basically back to where we were for the pulse that was held around Christmas time, Steve. So a bit of up and down in terms of skim milk powder pricing. And you were saying earlier, we've got a different set of buyers that tend to turn up to these pulse events, Steve.
Auction to auction, you get a decent comparison. With pulse, it's a little harder to say where that trend is heading. It's a bit time I did my nerd out again, Joe, to see where pulse gives us some heading on forward direction.
Sure, we all can't wait for that one, Steve.
Sure, you can't. Looking at the buying regions, in this case, China took a little less than half the sales, dipping lower. We're still well above where we were a year ago, but that's on pretty low stock. So it might have been expectations that this would pick up with stocks being so low, but it just isn't happening yet. Now, Chinese New Year is 3 weeks away. That certainly is a factor in the activity levels we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and just looking at Southeast Asian buying of skim milk powder, Steve, at this event, they did bounce back a little, but you can see they're really up and down from event to event there, Steve. It's a crazy looking curve.
It's like Californian roller coaster.
It is, absolutely. NZX futures are still quite strong, sitting above GDT results as they often do. Always do. You can see though that the US pricing is very much reflective of the internals. You mentioned earlier the issues with production out of California, where a lot of skim milk powder, non-fat dry milk is made. It's really those internal dynamics that are driving skim milk powder futures in the US, and they're well out of the money compared to other regions.
Turning to butter, we've seen some short-term lifts in butter prices in this event, and it reflects what's going on in the EU with some of that Q1 pricing being a lot stronger in recent weeks. And as I said earlier, EU prices lifted on GDT around 3% to be a little ahead of where futures are. It's the second event in a row where they've moved up, but compared to futures, a little stronger. So this is an interesting one. As we go further into the year, we see further information. We see more about the pattern of milk supply. The EU market will take shape.
Yeah, and just turning now to a global butter comparison, Steve, and US has by far the cheapest butter. And just reflective again of those internal dynamics, plenty of butter fat within the US. Very little moving into exports, though, as we saw earlier. using large amounts within that internal market. The other markets fairly well clustered in terms of futures, and GDT just sitting a bit higher on this latest event.
Quite the opposite to skim milk powder, isn't it?
It is. Yes.
Okay, mozzarella, the only other one worth calling out, and this is really interesting in terms of prospects for cheese exports into further into the year. Mozzarella improved this time. First time it's gone up for a while on GDT. Improved 3% to be just under 4,200. That's the equivalent of a tick above 4,000 euros a tonne, or in US parlance, it's just under $1.90 a pound. So that's pretty close to where the futures are in the US for cheddar. Would suggest that export competition is going to make that a pretty keen area when we see more production coming through. But at the moment, cheddar output remains tight. Chart of the week, Joe. How will you bring this home?
Well, Steve, we're back in China, and we've got some information out of China on milk production, liquid milk processing to November last year. It's slightly improved situation. You can just see that milk processing's a bit less negative than we've seen in the last couple of months. Milk production is still down. So we're starting to see, you can see whole milk powder production in China is rising seasonally, but output is still 26% down year on year. So those stocks will still be quite low, Steve. Cautious buying perhaps into 2025 when Chinese buyers come back on deck after New Year.
But as you say, that milk tightness is turning a little bit.
It is.
We need more of that liquid milk processing to soak up milk for this to really change. It's got a lot more pressure on powder supplies. Okay, that's all from us this week. Technology's had a bit to do with us today, so hopefully that's behind us. And we could have a better wrap up than this, but thanks for coming back to us. And again, Happy New Year.